Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khurram Iqbal. I am the Education Manager at ACCA Pakistan Karachi office. I look after the education portfolio for Sindh and Balochistan. I, I welcome you again in the fresh episode of the Bridging the Gap webinar. The focus area for today's session is the Board of Director, which is an important area in the syllabus of a strategic business leader exam. Uh, I thank on behalf of ACC, I want to thank Fatma Asad Said, who have joined us as a guest speaker for today's session. Let me tell you something about the Fatma. Fatma is an MBA graduate from LAMS, and she has also done her post graduation from LSE. Started her career with Cooper and Lybrand International, then PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's been over 23 years. Fatma is serving and delivering his professional experience in various areas, which includes delivering winning solutions and building thought leadership in the corporate governance, strategic change, organizational development, human capital management, diversity, and inclusion. Currently, Fatma is serving as the managing director for the corporate governance and people solution business vertical at Abacus. Thank you very much, Fatma, for taking out your time from your busy schedule for ACCA students, right? So without wasting any further minute, I hand over this session to you. And so over to you, Fatma.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. And Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the generous introduction, Khurram. It is indeed a pleasure to be here, and I'm always very grateful when ACCA approaches. I feel that you and your team are doing a remarkable service to the nation in terms of equipping our next generation of managers and leaders with the skill set and the capacity and the thinking power to do what it takes to add value to their organization and therefore the community at large. So it's always a pleasure to be part of this incredible initiative that you're undertaking at all times. This particular topic, and I will just share the screen, is on the board of directors. I do understand that we have a limited time, and Khurram, if you could just help me, how are we allocating the time? Is there a question and answer element to this?
We can spare the last 15 minutes, right, for the Q&A, right? So I advise the student to put all their question in the question panel, right? And during the Q&A session, we'll pick one by one each question with you, Fatma.
Okay, thank you very much. So over the next 30 to 40 minutes, I will walk you through the basic principles of corporate governance, and related to that, the board of directors, their responsibility, what constitutes a board, what are the elements and composition of a board. And as I said, this is more of an overview and an introduction to what happens at the governance level rather than a deep dive. My personal preference is always an interactive session, but because it's a webinar, I think we're limited in terms of how this is being managed. So without any further delay, I'll just take 10 seconds to share the screen. I'm sorry, just one second, it's not sharing. Are responsible for the governance of their companies. These are the main key words that you will see repeatedly. Then we talk about share owners and their responsibility. We have to also understand the main players that enhance and facilitate the concept of governance, specifically on corporate governance. So you have the board of directors, you have the share owners, then you have the management, who is responsible for ensuring execution of the strategic plans. And the director's responsibility is to supervise the management, and also the directors report into the share owners for the stewardship and adding long-term strategic value to the organization. Of course, we must keep in mind that the board's actions are always subject to the laws, the regulations, and the shareholders' objectives and their key concerns as well. The regulatory and legal compliance is extremely important. And do keep in mind that each country has its own set of governance framework. The Securities and Exchange Commission for Pakistan is the main regulatory body, which defines the broad structure and specific policies around how different kinds of organizations are functioned. Do keep in mind, usually the corporate governance code is targeting public listed companies or public companies rather than the private or entrepreneurial ventures. However, it is always a good practice to have the knowledge of what the corporate governance code defines, what it expects, because that very early on gets the organization, both at the board level as well as the management level, to be aligned with the corporate governance code, and it's good practice to have. Just stepping back a bit in terms of talking about governance, where did this all really start? And we sort of think back into not only the 1900s, but I believe it goes back to 300 years. It's a very interesting journey. Interestingly enough, and you can also Google it, it starts off by the East India Company, and where there were certain elements that were put into place. So I won't go into the story, but if you are interested, have a look at that. Google how the East India Company triggered off this concept of governance. We'll fast forward into the 20th century, and in the 1970s and 1980s, that is where this became a topic for corporate leaders. It became a very important aspect to focus on for organizations, because you see large organizations having, especially in the US and in the European markets, where the management were basically the main party that were in charge. So the board was more of a supportive role, and it was the management which was really driving the selection of the directors, really driving the strategy, really driving decisions that were related to the organization more so than just the execution of the strategy. And because there were certain incidents that happened in terms of not only monopolistic and antitrust issues, but also decisions that were detrimental to the organization, you see this particular topic becoming more of an academic interest into how do we strengthen and ensure that there is long-term sustainability and long-term value creation for the organization. In the 90s and into the early 2000s, you see, certain conflict of interest and lack of independence seeping in, especially where I'm not sure if you're familiar of what happened with the WorldCom and Enron debacles. And I'm sure you are, you've probably read about that, where there was a conflict of interest, there were independence issues, and because of that, you see the SECP in the US and then other regulatory bodies across the world coming down very hard, starting off with the audit firms who were also offering non-audit services. And there was a conflict of interest right there. So in 2003, when you have the Sarbanes-Oxley Act being issued, many of these organizations divested their businesses, audit versus non-audit, and that started a chain reaction of how other corporate entities, especially in the public listed space, had to strengthen vigilance and monitoring and oversight at the board level. Fast forward to 2007 and 2008, when the financial crisis happened, again, the financial services industry was very strongly hit, starting off with Lehman Brothers, and then other banks joining in that play. Markets, stock exchanges were hit quite considerably at that time. So what you see is an evolution and a need for tighter monitoring. You see a need for stringent controls. You see a need for the regulatory body to really define in a great detail of how companies should be directed in terms of managing risk and also in terms of compliance to laws and regulations. Essentially, if we go back to defining from this stems, what is the role of the board of directors? I feel that really it's about leadership, and it's about sending these strong signals to the organization that we must behave with integrity. We must ensure there is strong communication and ensure that the demanding expectations of the stakeholders, which could be your customers, your suppliers, your vendors, even the people, obviously the employees that work, and also to some extent the government as well, they must be recognized and attended to as well. And if there is a clear direction that is given right from the board level, that again has a great impact on the sustainability and value creation. So what are we talking about? We talk about value for, I'll just, is this coming in the way? We talk about leadership for efficiency. So you have to ensure that you are competing in the global economy. If your organization is more local and national, it does create jobs for the economy that you are related to. Then we talk about leadership for probity, which means that how do you inspire investor confidence? How do you ensure that the management's integrity is maintained? Because at the end of the day, this links up to reputational elements as well. And reputational risk is extremely important for organizations to keep a check on. What kind of brand do you have? What kind of relationships? Because it drives relationships with the banks and the financial institutions. It also drives relationships and confidence with your customers and your people as well from a branding perspective. Of course, then there's responsibility and accountability, understanding who the stakeholders are and what are their interests and how is the organization serving the interest of the stakeholders. And of course, lastly and not the least is building trust. Because as we know that companies and economies are based on how you build trust for a certain product or a certain service. You have to put yourself in the shoe of a customer and think back that why would you go to organization X, let's say, for a certain product, as simple as a cup of tea or a box of milk. What does it make you decide? What makes you decide that you will buy from organization X versus organization Y? Similarly, if you're looking for, as an employee, as a potential employer, why would you apply to an organization where you feel that they take care of their employees and they are linked in with or they're really aligned with what their people want and how they add value and how they develop their people and retain them and motivate them? So all of this is actually, the strategy is driven from the board level. The tone at the top is essential and critical for the sustainability and longevity of any organization. So who are the principal actors? Which principal actors are we talking about? We talk about share owners, the board of directors, and the management. So essentially, you see double arrows over here, the linkages and the relationships between these three main principal actors. The share owners are the ones who actually appoint and dismiss the board of directors. Again, I'm just reinforcing this point. This is obviously linked to the public listed or public owned companies. However, this can very well apply to private sector entities, private companies as well, private limited companies as well, because the shareholders are the ones who are not only providing the capital, but they have equity holding, and therefore they drive the decision making on who sits at the board level. The board of directors reports to the share owner. So that means adding value, sustainable value to share owners is one of their main objectives. Then we have the relationship between the board of directors and the management. The board of directors is overseeing the management, and the management, of course, reports into the board of directors and ensures alignment to the strategic oversight and direction that is being provided. The share owners are providing the capital or the funds into what the management, and the management here is CEO and management. The CEO is the one who is appointed by the board of directors. It is a great responsibility to have the right person at the right seat, because the CEO then oversees, develops, manages, retains, motivates his or her team to deliver on the overall objectives of the organization. But the management also acts as an agent for the share owners, because ultimately they have to be very mindful that the existence of that organization is for adding value and value creation for the share owners. The board is a facilitating body to ensure that the interests of both the share owners and management is aligned to the strategic objectives of the organization. This is a quick snapshot of the shareholders. The board governance framework. Right at the top is the shareholders or the share owners. And this gives you a good viewing of what is corporate governance all about and where do the board of directors fit into it. So what you see is that you have the shareholders. Just below that is the board of directors, which, as I mentioned, achievement of strategic objectives and value creation, and fulfill the responsibilities in compliance with law and other regulatory bodies. On the left side, you see the roles and activities which have to be overseen in order to support this framework, where you have the chairman, the board meetings that take place, the corporate secretary. The role of the corporate secretary is extremely critical, reporting and disclosure, and of course the governance systems and controls. Below the board of directors, you see a list of broad activities that the board must focus on. A good board will always look at strategy, corporate policies, provide again oversight and monitoring mechanisms, board governance instruments, and then also define very clearly the TOR. In this day and age of technology and digitization, and if not before, information systems and the way that information flows and is captured and is made available is extremely important. Now, below the board of directors, that is further segmented into two components. One is the board committees, and the other is the CEO and the management. Each of them have a very defined set of responsibilities. Broadly speaking, and usually most of the Securities and Exchange Commission bodies across the world focus on primarily the audit, remuneration, and also the nomination/governance committee. However, in this era of technology disruption, in this especially a post-COVID world, you see other committees also being formed. While they are not essential as part of the governance code in terms of compliance, but they are extremely good to have. For example, many organizations and some of the boards that I sit on, they have an IT committee. They have a strategy committee. They have a monitoring and evaluation committee. So it depends on the need of the organization, what other committees would suit them well, because you must understand when the board meets, they do have limited time. The individuals who are sitting there, whether they are executive directors, non-executive or independent directors, have limited time. There would be, again, according to our SACP rule, there has to be at least 4 meetings that take place of the full board. That's once every quarter and more if required. then the committees also have a certain minimum requirement in as time how much they should meet on an annual basis. It is up to the board to decide that to what extent are we satisfied with the information which is accurate, reliable, and complete enough for them to take informed decisions. That is why the committees are formed, because the full board will requires more of a deep dive, and these committees feed into that in terms of going into a detailed review, assessment, analysis based on what information is being provided. And also, it's a two-way street. They would also request and define what information they require, which will benefit the organization. The other element is the CEO and component, is the CEO and management, where you have the executive committee, essentially the C level, and of course, internal controls and assurance to ensure that the alignment from the board of directors to the dashboard and key performance indicators that have been provided to the CEO and management are monitored carefully on a timely basis, and the risk is also being monitored so as to ensure that there is limited damage control. Which reminds me, there's another committee, which is the Risk Management Committee. Many organizations and good organizations are ensuring that they have a risk management committee, which is responsible for essentially developing, providing the strategic direction in what the enterprise risk management framework should look like for that organization, and sending that signal and ensuring that that is communicated effectively to the CEO and management. Of course, right at the bottom, across all of these areas, are the different internal audit, external audit, the other assurance providers that would support it. And sorry, this has come in the way. So these are the main elements which will ensure that we are keeping track of how the organization is delivering on its primary responsibilities in terms of how the objectives have been set. Very quickly, I'll just talk about the gender diversity at the board level. This is just interesting, like what if it had been Lehman Sisters? But Lehman Brothers, as we all know, triggered off the 2008 financial crisis. And since then, there is a drive to ensure that there is an increased percentage of women who are represented at the board level. Studies have shown that most of the organizations जो आपके Fortune 500 या Fortune 100 companies हैं, they still have a very limited representation of females at the board level, 8.4%. While companies are trying to increase the representation and regulatory bodies are making it essential for them to ensure, even in Pakistan, and Pakistan is, I feel, is quite progressive in that. The public listed companies now have to have at least one woman on the board, if not more. They are looking at a third representation. But studies have shown that with increased representation of women board of directors, there is a greater impact on financial performance. So much so that there is an increase on return on equity to 53%, return on sales 42%, and return on invested capital to 66%. This is how they have compared it in terms of the boards that have women as compared to companies that do not have women. And there is a marked difference. It's about diversity, about thinking from a different angle. It's also about bringing on a certain talent which can contribute great value to the organization. So it is important for both our men and women to focus on asking on themselves the question that what would it take for me to rise to the board level? Please do keep in mind that there is a fine line between being at the C level of an organization and then transiting onto the board level. There are certain elements which have to be kept in mind when you are part of the C level at the executive level as well. You would be probably looking at a particular function, whether it's marketing, finance, HR, etc., operations, production, or even at the CEO level, which is obviously a consolidated version. But above that, what the board is essentially trying to provide is a bird's eye view direction to any organization. You have to step back and look at it from maybe 1,000, 2,000 feet, and also have the vision to develop um, a direction which is long term enough, which is not only catering to current challenges, but is ensuring that the organization remains relevant for a longer period of time. And there are different roles that different board members would play. You talk about a pilot who is really steering the direction. There's someone who is the architect of the building blocks and the foundation of an organization. I'm sure you've, in your financial modules, you've talked about the company being a going concern. And for it to be a going concern, obviously profitability and revenue generation is extremely important. Of course, with that is the liquidity of the organization. But remember, the attainment of a certain performance today does not mean that the organization will exist tomorrow. We have many examples over the last 30, 40 years. Yahoo versus Google. Yahoo was an early mover into this space, and it hardly exists as compared to Google. You have companies like Kodak, you have companies like Nokia, to name just a few. There are so many examples of organizations who did not move fast enough because they were too focused on what the present performance was rather than, and there's case studies done on these organizations by Harvard and by other top leading organizations as institutions as well, where they say that in certain cases it was a boardroom failure, in certain cases it was a management failure to see beyond where they are at this point in time. So do keep that in mind and really think about, what do I really need to do if I need to go to the board level, from a financial knowledge perspective, from a culture perspective, from a strategic thinking perspective. So moving on, we talk about the broad board of directors' responsibilities. Top of the list, selecting the CEO, identifying a qualified, capable CEO who has the leadership potential and leadership capability and demonstrated capability to not only spearhead the organization, but ensure that it is aligned with the direction that the board is setting. It's an extremely critical task for the board of directors. Setting the tone at the top. Now, this is very interesting, and this particular list of responsibilities, I have also looked at the Harvard Business Review database, and they've done considerable work on governance. I myself have been certified as a corporate director from Harvard Business School as well. So there's a lot of material that they have shared, and there's a lot of material that they continue to update in terms of the governance frameworks and the responsibilities of the board of directors. And it's quite fascinating. Then we have talk about corporate strategy, monitoring the implementation of strategic plans, the risk appetite. It's extremely important to determine what is the mood of the board in terms of how risk averse would they be, or are they willing to take that leap of faith, especially in this uh, age of disruption, and where technology is playing, was really shaking up the models, the business models as well. Is it wise to take more risk because we are navigating in a space where we don't know what kind of skill set we require at this point in time? We don't know in 10 years' time how things are going to transpire, how the customer's expectations and profile is changing, how the external environment in terms of economies are emerging, especially more now in this post-COVID world. Also focusing on the integrity and clarify financial reporting and other disclosures. Unfortunately, the governance framework has also come under a lot of scrutiny, and it is tightening the level of documentation and the requirements for reporting. So while we cannot challenge that, and well, we could if we do a research and say that is this really required, but at the end of the day, it is absolutely essential for organizations to ensure compliance to the required financial reporting, and also understand what kind of disclosures are required for their organization in terms of the sector they belong to, in terms of the industry they represent as well, and work with integrity. I cannot stress that enough. Allocating capital, so long-term investments versus short-term investments, reviewing and understanding annual operating budgets and plans. Of course, checking the organization, business continuity and resilience. We saw that in 2020. There was a shake-up for the whole world, a shake-up for all organizations, large-scale entrepreneurial ventures, small and medium-sized businesses. Has it been able to really withstand the crisis that we have gone through? And nominating directors and committee members for overseeing the effective corporate governance and the compliance program. Moving on, because I'm very conscious of the time, is the CEO and management responsibilities. Very quickly, I think most of you would be broadly familiar with this, but we talk about business operations, strategic planning, capital allocation, management of risk. So they're feeding this information into the board, and the board is also providing their oversight from a bird's eye view. Accurate and transparent financial reporting and disclosures is the responsibility of the management, as well as developing the plans and the budgets, and of course, ensuring business resilience. The board structure, there are three elements of the board structure. One is the board composition, and these are the different factors that are taken into account. What the size should be. Each regulatory body would have a different size. You would need a minimum of 7. That is for a public listed company, minimum of 7. For private, you can have 4. What is the composition like? Executive versus non-executive versus independent directors. What is the percentage of these, and what is the role that each of these categories of directors play? What kind of characteristics and experience are we looking for? We must ensure that there is diversity, not only in terms of gender, but in terms of knowledge, in terms of capability, in terms of experience, in terms of the outlook that an individual, and personality as well, because that is what makes for a board which would be contributing value in its discussion. There should not be so much similarity in terms of the subject matter experts that you put onto the board. Independence is extremely important. Election, and obviously the time commitments. For public listed companies or public companies, there is a process of election, again defined as per each regulatory body for every country. In SECP, they have it very well defined. And also the time commitments. The board members must understand what are they getting into and what kind of commitment do they require, because there is there is extensive board papers that come to all the directors for preparation. So it's not just that meeting that takes place 4 times a year, and then there are the board committee meetings as well, but also the preparation. For me personally, I serve on 5 boards other than my own board, and that's quite a lot of time where I have to review the documents and understand the challenges of each organization that I'm in, and each of them are in a different industry and in a different culture and different strategic objectives. So that contributes, that goes into the entire time commitment that is required by board members. Board leadership, the approaches, and the chairperson. Now, what does it mean by approaches? That means that what kind of setup do you want to have at the board level? This is a bit more relevant to the US and also to the European. In Europe, they have a 2-tiered board approach as well. In the US, they have a different model. We have where we have just a unitary 1-level board, and then there is the management, and also the selection of the chairperson. In some cases, the chairperson and the CEO are the same, but there is that particular dynamic is not really encouraged, and many regulatory bodies, including SECP, have ensured that the role, the chairperson should not be the CEO. So these are 2 different roles to be given to 2 different incumbents. That's something to think about as well. But there are certain boards which are private limited who would actually club the person, and the chairperson would be the CEO as well. Then you have the board committees and the structures. As I mentioned, it's about doing a deep dive into the main areas, the key strategic areas of the organization, primarily audit, nomination, compensation, and slash HR committees, and also the level of documentation that is required, and what are the charters. So it's very important to understand what is the TOR of the board, what is the TOR of this board committee? Is it in line with the regulatory body? Is there something else that we need to add? So there's a lot of conversation on how does the board committees enhance their role in adding value and giving more oversight and clearer direction to the management. The board committees then have deliberate based on that information, and then they put their suggestions up for approval to the full board. The board committees do not approve. They will present it to the full board, and that is where approvals and ratification take place. Of course, it is extremely important, and that goes for all levels, but they must comply with independence clauses as well as legal and regulatory frameworks. So that was a quick snapshot of the board of directors in terms of governance, in terms of the roles and responsibilities, the 3 main actors, which are the management, the shareholders, and the board of directors. And then, you know, the associated corporate, the structure of the board in terms of leadership, in terms of the committees, in terms of the composition. Just to wrap up, we're in 2021. And the reason I wrote 2020 over here is that 2020 has fundamentally shaken up the way the world sees governance. It has shaken up the way the organizations behave. Have a look at how organizations like Google, not Google, but Netflix or Tesla, to name a few, look at how their boards are now working. They are actually putting pressure on the governance frameworks to fundamentally revamp and redefine, because it's a new era where we have to rethink the alignment of strategy and capital allocation, especially for human capital, especially because we don't know what kind of skills we will require 10 years from now. So how is the organization investing today to create a sustainable structure and plan for the organization? The other aspect is integrating financial and ESG. ESG is essentially certain elements which now the European regulatory body and the US regulatory bodies, but more so European at this point in time, that's environment, social and governance metrics. And this is an extension of the UN SDGs. They are coming under a lot of pressure to integrate ESG and financial for deliberation and decision making at the board level, and cascade it down in terms of how the organization functions and adds value and creates value. Then we have data information security risks. How are they incorporated into the ERM? How is it being monitored? Are we doing enough to safeguard the organization from data security risks? There have been quite a few, आपको पता है hackers हैं, the compromise हो रहे हैं systems around the world. So what more can organizations do, because we are already in a virtual environment? 2020 has shown us that and allowed us to transit. Also, I think very important is how are we adapting at the board level the structures and the composition to external challenges? Fundamentally, we exist because our customer has a need. And are we really understanding the changes, the shift in what our customer needs? Are we also understanding the shift in how our employees are thinking and what they want and what kind of value they want to create? And thirdly, how are economies, what are the challenges for different economies around the world? So it is important for us to think back and link it up to how the government, regulatory bodies are looking at governance. But one thing I will definitely wrap up and say is it is becoming more stringent. Level of documentation is becoming very intense. So it is important at the board level for the board of directors to have comprehensive and deep understanding of the requirements, and each industry has its own set of requirements, but also ensure that the people that are there at the board level and the people who are at the management level are aligned in terms of the skills and knowledge that are required to ensure that long-term value creation is sustained. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Fatma. Let's take the questions. So the first question for you today is, to what extent the BOD, the Board of Directors, are responsible for their decisions? As we all know, the BOD are apprised by the management. So whatever the management tells them, the BOD have to consider it sufficient and make a decision accordingly.
Okay, I'm just going to try and stop sharing this. Has it stopped sharing?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? आपकी आवाज थोड़ी सी break हो रही थी.
Right. So the question is, to what extent the BOD are responsible for the decision? As we all know that the BOD are apprised by the management. So whatever the management tells, the BOD has to consider it.
That's a very good question and a very pertinent question. And we've had that discussions in a couple of boards that I sit on as well. You're absolutely right that the board is to some extent at the behest of the information that is provided by the management. They're the ones on ground, they have access to detailed level of information. And given the time that board members can devote and they are associated with the organization, it falls upon the management to provide the relevant and accurate information for good decision making. So it does at times skew towards what is the information that is provided. However, that is why it is also important for the board to have a continuous revisit on the dashboard that is created? And what kind of framework? Are they just looking at the numbers and the presentations, or are they also channeling a discussion on, okay, this is fine, but this is what we're really interested in? So you see that happening, and over the last couple of decades, you see this shift in terms of the power balance. As I mentioned, in the 80s, the power balance was more towards the management side, but the governing body, the board of directors, to a large extent, is paying lip service, or just attending to what the management was providing them. But that has fundamentally shifted over the last 30 years, and with more stringent controls, the board is now becoming more involved in ensuring that the dashboards are developed in such a way that there is more conversation and more time for strategic thinking. Again, I would say there's still a lot to be done. My own experience, some of the boards that I sit in are extremely visionary, and they don't spend too much time on what is on the current reports that are coming in. But there are some boards who are driven by at the behest, as I said, of what the management is providing. That said, we do question aggressively the information that the board provides, the management provides, and we do challenge what they say. That is our responsibility. But honestly, it is the culture and the environment of each board which defines the relationship between the board and the management.
Right. Thank you very much, Fatma, for providing a very detailed and brief answer to this question. So the next question is, may I know how is someone being selected to the board of directors? Is it through submitting resumes similar to other positions in the company, or is it anyone from the public who have the leadership and required knowledge can be chosen as board?
Okay, good question again. Because selection of board of directors जो होती है ना, and I think I mentioned it in part of my presentation as well, is one has to understand that there's a fine line between when you are at the management, even executive leadership level, and when you go onto the board level as well. Understanding what the difference is key. The second element is um, to demonstrate at the leadership level that you have the capacity to think on a broader level, even if you are a subject matter expert, which is not necessarily operational in nature. That is extremely important. The third thing I would say is if you are at the executive leadership level, or you believe that you can add value on serving a board, I would encourage you to go through the program that PICG offers, or any other corporate governance program that is being run, which certifies you as a board member. So one of the things that are happening right now is a database of potential board certified individuals that the PICG is keeping. I think LUMS ka bhi hota hai. They also run this program for corporate boards, for board of directors as well. So why don't you explore that particular avenue? वो database बन जाते हैं. Usually organizations that are looking for board members also look at that database, that who has been certified. The fourth thing is your network. It is extremely important. And who have you come across in terms of dealing with from a professional perspective, from a business perspective? At what level have you added value as a professional? Who have you worked with? That makes a lot of difference. So develop your networks as well, and engage with people who are industry leaders, who are corporate leaders, who are even government leaders for that matter, if you want to serve on public listed companies or in the public sector as well. So these are 2 or 3 things that I would encourage you to do.
Right. Another question is, may I know how do you equip yourself to be eligible to be a board? I think it is similar to the previous question, right?
Gee, eligibility, though, quite frankly speaking, I mean, if I go for my own experience, my name was given because I interacted with different individuals. So it came back to networks, but it also came back to when I had worked as a professional with different corporate leaders, both at the board level and at the C level. So I had demonstrated my contribution across different sectors and different organizations. But eligibility is also a certain years of experience. I would say that if you feel that you qualify for at least an executive leadership position in terms of knowledge and in terms of experience and in terms of capability, then I believe that you would be ready to go on to the board level. There's nothing stopping you. It's just a matter of exploring what are the components that you have to look for. For example, a command over financial metrics and financial information, strategic thinking, as I mentioned, the culture element as well, because the board should have diverse representation. And as I said, it's not just gender, it's also about knowledge and industry experience and function experience as well, just to name a few. So that would and obviously the last thing is, I'm just repeating myself, is certification like BICG does.
Right. So the next question is statement true? Company secretary has an administrative responsibility to the management. However, the reporting line of a company secretary is to board of directors.
Yes, that is true. The company secretary is essentially, the role that the company secretary plays is basically facilitating. He's a secretary to the board, and his role is not so much to the management. Um, he is supplied the information that is required, and he is a channel for sending information from the management to the board and vice versa. But he or she should also be very well conversant with the legal and the regulatory frameworks that exist in that particular country, and to ensure that the board papers and all documentation and all disclosures that are necessary are taken care of on a timely basis, as not only directed by the board, but also directed by the CEO and management if there is someone else who is playing a different role from, let's say, a risk perspective or a technology perspective, where information has to be given. But it is an extremely critical role that the company secretary plays.
Okay, so the last question for today is, are all directors be liable if anything happens to the company?
Are all directors?
Be liable if anything happens to the company, if any decision goes against the company, right? So is all the director, the board of director, the team is responsible for that?
Well, I mean, the board is accountable, but what decision are we talking about? You see, there are different kinds of decision. If it is a business decision and things go wrong, that's part of the game. Business is about you win some, you lose some, right? But if it is something which is legal non-compliance, if it is non-compliance on regulatory, if it is unethical, if it is shaking the integrity of the organization, that is a different matter. So the severity of accountability differs in terms of the kind of decision that you are referring to. Yes, the board ultimately is accountable for ensuring the integrity of the organization and ensuring that the tone at the top is giving clear signals to the management that this is how we shall behave, not only from an integrity and ethics perspective, but also from a compliance perspective, and also in terms of ensuring that the share owners are, their interest and other stakeholders' interests are fully aligned with. However, the degree of severity of penalty differs. Again, you have to refer back to the regulatory framework. You can see that in the public sector companies, the board members are liable for other, unfortunately, other bodies that do come into play and question the due process or a lack of due process in terms of their appointment. Article B, you must have seen the news and various, I won't name, but it is ongoing over the last few months as well. So the accountability does go back to that. Is why it's absolutely important. And you must realize that being on the board is an extremely rewarding journey in terms of learning, in terms of contributing, but it's also an extremely responsible and challenging position to be in, because you're not only safeguarding the organization, but you're also safeguarding your own interests and you're safeguarding your own integrity. You're part of a bigger team. So soch samajh ke, whenever you are, inshallah, I hope some of you go into that particular role and vie for that role, but do conduct your due diligence on the organization, the culture, the people who are there, the background. It is absolutely important, even if that organization is well known. Do your homework before you say yes to going on to any board.
Right. Thank you once again, Fatma, for your time. And it was, I think our student has been benefited with this session, and that the kind of knowledge, the experience which you have shared with them. We are thankful to you for that. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank all the attendees today who joined today and have put question in the question panel. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Fatma, again. See you soon again, inshallah, in some webinar. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you very much. Good Hafiz.